Welcome to Pimprenelle. This is the second episode of our three-part series exploring Summerhill, one of the oldest democratic and self-governed schools in the world. If you haven't yet listened to the first episode, I highly recommend starting there. Each episode builds on the previous one, forming a continuous thread of reflection that deepens as we go, from personal narratives to the questions of authority, and finally to a broader critique of justice in education. In the first episode, we explored the life trajectories of four former Summerhill students, focusing on what becomes the children who are never forced to learn. Their stories challenge conventional ideas of success, discipline, and preparation for the real world. This second episode shifts the focus. Here, we'll delve into the nature of authority and power relations in education. How does a school without imposed rules, without vertical hierarchies, handle conflict, discipline, and social cohesion? What happens when power is shared rather than imposed? As in the first episode, I'll begin by setting out a brief theoretical framework to guide our thinking. Then we'll hear directly from the former students, Mary, Dave, Mike, and Boris, whose reflections offer unique insight into what it means to grow in a system where freedom and authority are not opposites, but co-constructed every day. So, the notion of authority is central in this episode. Authority refers to an asymmetrical relationship in which a person, institution, or idea commands obedience or recognition without necessarily resorting to force. It relies on a form of legitimacy, that is, a recognition by those who submit to it of the validity or rightfulness of this authority. For example, children are generally subject to the authority of adults, notably because of their age, which is perceived as a guarantee of experience. Sometimes, this authority is based on a judgment of utility. I recognize this authority because it protects me, educates me, guides me. But it can also take the form of a transcendent authority, one that relies neither on the personal interest nor on the benevolence of the leader, but on a symbolic hierarchy considered natural or sacred. For instance, in Leviathan, Thomas Hobbes shows that subjects may obey an unjust or cruel sovereign out of fear of chaos. From this perspective, the legitimacy of power lies not into the virtue of the ruler, but in their superior role as a guarantor of order. In the school setting, the question of authority is especially pressing. The traditional image of the all-knowing teacher facing students who are expected to listen illustrates how the line between authority based on the utility and transcendent authority can often be blurred. Indeed, even if the teacher is, in principle, present to guide the student toward knowledge and well-being, they can also be the source of trauma. Who hasn't been hurt by a teacher's remark, something they had no choice but to accept or endure, precisely because this power to humiliate or correct is socially recognized as part and parcel of the teacher's role? In most French schools, although some pedagogical practices are now beginning to challenge this model, the overall approach remains top-down, and the asymmetrical relationship between teachers and students is seen as self-evident. For some, this transcendent authority is perceived as a necessity. These individuals start from the premise that a child does not yet know what it is good or bad for them, and that the adult, by virtue of their greater experience, is legitimate in guiding them. For others, the rigidity of this form of authority can also be seen as a structuring constraint, one that allows the child to grow by confronting external otherness. In short, growth and fulfillment may only be possible through encountering and ultimately surpassing a form of authority that precedes and challenges us. What is certain is that authority in schools, as normalized today, can produce harmful effects, of which school bullying is only one of the symptoms. The power asymmetry between teachers and students, perceived as normal, even sometimes necessary, sometimes renders symbolic abuse, everyday humiliation, or the denial of children's voices invisible. By naturalizing the superiority of the adult and framing submission as a condition of learning, the school system risks silencing subjectivities instead of elevating them. This is not about rejecting all forms of authority, but about questioning its forms, its foundations, and its effects. Under what conditions does authority educate, and when does it begin to oppress? The link between authority and school bullying is deep, yet often misunderstood. It's not just about determining whether authority prevents or enables bullying, but about understanding how its configuration shapes social relations among students, and thus the possibilities for violence or protection. Because authority is not limited to the adult child relationship, it permeates the institution's implicit norms, dictating what can be said, seen, sanctioned, or ignored. In a traditional school setting, when authority is vertical, distant, or rigid, it tends to naturalize hierarchies and make microviolences invisible. It can silence victims, disqualify their words, or even legitimize certain humiliation as part of the learning process. Conversely, we might ask, if authority is reconfigured, if we think about it differently, can it become a lever to reduce interpersonal violence? The example of Summerhill invites us to formulate this hypothesis while also revealing its tensions. At Summerhill, authority is fundamentally different. Because it is not imposed, it is built. It is based on mutual respect, freedom of choice, and the active participation of students in school life. Power is not monopolized by adults, it is shared, discussed, and negotiated in collective meetings where everyone, child and adult alike, has an equal voice. Now let's delve into the students' experiences of Summerhill. So Boris. Before arriving at Summerhill, Boris describes himself as a very shy student, shaped by experiences of bullying in his previous schools. So before Summerhill, he attended very strict institutions where relationships with adults were very hierarchical, but bullying was often ignored. It was hard to prove and poorly addressed. At Summerhill, everything changes for him. The horizontal and democratic environment, where students' voices truly carry weight, gradually transforms his behavior. He explains how he went from being a reserved student to someone capable of speaking up in meetings, taking a stand, and exposing himself to others. He shares that at Summerhill, he learned to invite bullying, not because he wanted it, but because he realized that by playing along with teasing, by turning it into humor, he could socially integrate. This form of controlled self-depreciation, though ambiguous, became for him a way to regain control over a form of violence he had once passively endured. In a democratic school, even conflict becomes manageable because it is visible. He said, at Summerhill, it's such a small community that bullying is always noticeable, so it can be addressed. But he does not romanticize shared authority. He recounts a significant episode in which his own friends, during a school meeting, deliberately voted for a harsher punishment than expected against him, purely for fun. It was a moment of realization. Democratic power can also be manipulated, and the majority can become a tool for symbolic pressure. This event revealed to him the limits of school democracy, and above all, the importance of teaching students the responsibility that comes with having a voice and a vote. Boris's story illustrates how deeply the type of authority exercised within a school influences bullying dynamics. In the traditional schools he attended, adult authority, based on verticality and distance, contributed to the invisibilization of peer violence. Without spaces for expression or recognition, bullying became a tolerated, even normalized reality. At Summerhill, it is precisely the redistribution of authority, its circulation between students and adults, its rooting in a culture of dialogue, that makes such violence more visible and thus more addressable. But this horizontality is not without ambiguity. It doesn't eliminate power, it reshapes it. The case of Boris, unfairly sanctioned by a collective vote driven by play, shows that bullying can also slip into the cracks of school democracy. In other words, when everyone holds a bit of authority, violence doesn't disappear, it changes form. This highlights a fundamental requirement. If democratic school environments are to truly protect students, it is not enough to redistribute power. We must educate students in its responsible use. On the case of Mary, she attended Summerhill for 8 years. In her account, she does not speak directly of being bullied, but she does refer to social dynamics and tensions that exist, even within a democratic setting. She acknowledges that, like in all schools, there were bullies, popular kids, and social tensions, though these were less visible or less violent than in traditional schools. According to her, Teachers made effort to prevent exclusion, but bullying could still occur, often in subtle ways. She emphasizes that Summerhill offered institutional protection mechanisms. An ombudsman system allowed students to appeal to an impartial mediator before bringing a situation to a school meeting. There was also a bully list, collectively voted sanction that carried strong social consequences, such as the loss of activities, exclusion from cues, and so on. The fact that this punishment was both voted on and visible is revealing. The handling of bullying was embedded in the culture of shared authority. But one stands out the most in Mary's testimony is her internal relationship to authority. She explains that in traditional schools, she had developed a compulsive need to please authority figures, a form of internalized submission, often gendered. At Summerhill, this dynamic shifted. Living in an egalitarian environment where teachers were approachable and supportive allowed her to gradually loosen her need for external validation. She states, "I still want to show them that I'm good, but I'm also getting supported and nudged." In other words, authority is no longer a force that judges, but a presence that supports. Mary's case reveals a form of internalized symbolic harassment. It's not authority itself that humiliates, but the internalized gaze of authority, the one that compels you to please, to conform, to remain silent. Summerhill, through its democratic and egalitarian structure, helps to diffuse this logic and replace it with an authority grounded in trust, mutual recognition, and the right to make mistakes. This case perfectly complements Boris's. While his story illustrates a rebuilding of relationships with others through collective speech, Mary's highlights a more intimate work on subjectivity, where authority ceases to be a judging force and becomes a lever for emancipation. Importantly, her testimony also reveals how this transformation is gendered. The compulsion to please, the fear of disappointing, and the internalization of adult expectations often weigh more heavily on girls, making the shift from submission to self-trust not only psychological but deeply political. Now Mike. So Mike joined at Summerhill in the 60s after attending other schools where he felt inadequate, particularly due to his dyslexia. He recalls that in those traditional schools, there were no recognition of his specific needs. Academic norms were rigid and teachers offered no individualized support. It was only at Summerhill that a teacher finally said to him, "I see that your writing isn't working for you. Would you like me to teach you how to write differently?" That seemingly simple moment marked a turning point in his life. He encountered an adult who cared without imposing, who offered rather than ordered, who recognized him and his uniqueness instead of measuring him against a single standard. This educational relationship, built on availability and attentiveness, stood in stark contrast to what he had experienced before. At Summerhill, he says he never felt subjected to vertical authority, but rather encountered adult figures who played a parental, caring, and dialogic role. It wasn't authority without rules, it was authority embodied in a human and relational presence. He emphasizes, the teachers take a genuine interest in your development, like a parent would. This respectful, attentive, horizontal relationship allowed him not only to progress academically, but also to regain confidence. Now let's talk about Dave. So Dave entered Summerhill as a young child. From the very beginning, he felt an unprecedented sense of freedom, a complete break from what he imagined school to be. What struck him the most wasn't the absence of compulsory lessons, but the availability of adults, and above all, the possibility of being taken seriously in his personal projects. Early on, he developed a passion for cinema at Summerhill, and this passion for cinema was highly encouraged at Summerhill, not as an extracurricular hobby, but as true backbone of his learning. He spent days writing scripts, building sets, and shooting short films, sometimes with the help of his teachers. He states, "What I take away from Summerhill isn't a school curriculum, but the freedom to build a personal project supported by available adults." His relationship to authority was fundamentally transformed. At no point Dave described authority as infantilizing or punitive. On the contrary, because adults never imposed anything on him, they became creative partners, supporters, and mentors. It wasn't a case of no structure, but rather a flexible, adaptive framework, one that deeply respected the child's subjectivity. This horizontal authority, grounded in trust-based relationships, allows him to fully commit to his patients without fear of being judged or held back by conventional school standards. Dave does not mention school bullying in his account, neither as a victim nor as a witness. However, he does describe an overall atmosphere of tolerance made possible by the school's culture of coexistence. At Summerhill, he says, "You learn to tolerate people you don't like, to live together with differences, simply because you have no choice. The space is small, relationships are constant, and eventually everyone gets to know each other beyond first impressions. Conflict isn't denied, but regulated through spaces for discussion and, most importantly, through the habit of collective confrontation." Another form of authority emerges in history: self-authority, the ability to choose whether or not to attend class, to invest in a personal project, or to play all day fosters a sense of self-discipline. Dave explains that when he arrived at university, he had a head start. Not academically, but because he knew how to organize his time, to follow a passion, and work independently. In his view, that is the true purpose of education, to form individuals capable of self-direction. Finally, Dave rejects the idea that educational freedom leads to chaos or laxity. On the contrary, he insists that at Summerhill, freedom is always paired with responsibility: the responsibility to choose, to manage conflicts, to participate in meetings, to take part in rulemaking. Authority is experienced not as an imposed order, but as a collective contract in constant evolution, one in which everyone has a role to play. So Dave embodies a relationship to authority that is neither conflictual nor passive, but creative and cooperative. What he experiences at Summerhill is a form of authority that recedes in favor of support, one that provides structure without constraint, one that frees inner momentum rather than channeling it. While his testimony doesn't directly address bullying, it sheds light on how a horizontal educational framework can help prevent certain forms of violence by fostering social relationships built on mutual respect, coexistence, and responsibility. This second episode has allowed us to explore how authority can be exercised differently in schools, not through an ideal model, but through the lived experience of a unique space, Summerhill. It is important to acknowledge the limits of my research. It is based on the accounts of 4 voluntary former students, all generally satisfied with their experience. Their trajectories are singular and cannot be used to generalize or to draw conclusions about the effectiveness of the model. Absent here are other voices, critical or silent. Moreover, the retrospective nature of the interviews involves a subjective reconstruction of their school experience, at times idealized. In short, the goal of this exploration is not to idealize Summerhill, but to question the ordinary configurations of school authority and the effects they produce on individuals. The analysis of the narratives collected highlights a central insight: the structure of authority profoundly influences students' social, relational, and psychological well-being. This inquiry invites a critical reflection on the concrete ways in which authority is established in schools, and how these modalities shape, often lastingly, subjectivities, power dynamics, and forms of violence or recognition. The third episode of this series will extend this reflection by adopting an intersectional perspective. Is Summerhill a school reserved for the privileged, or can it be imagined as a true promise of social justice in education? We will explore the social, economic, and cultural dimensions of access to such an education, as well as the political limits of a model based on autonomy in a world structured by inequality.